All right, good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the present and the future of the construction industry. And we have the pleasure of having with us Amy Marks from Autodesk. Hi, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm doing great over here in New Jersey. Thank you.
Yeah. We cannot not mention that we are recording this during a full lockdown. And so how you're going through the lockdown in New Jersey?
Well, we're sort of here at the epicenter. So I have, I've been in my home actually since March 10th. I think I've cooked every meal since March 10th in my home without having any takeout, even coffee.
Well, that's remarkable. And so fun enough, and we're going to go straight into also the topic of the conversation, but also you come from an entrepreneurial background, and you started at Autodesk, one of the major player in the technology for construction, and not only. And you've been in a job for not too long, for I think around 3 months, if I'm correct, maybe 4th now. But how is that?
I'm definitely a new, yes. You know, it's great. I actually decided to come to Autodesk after owning my own prefabrication consulting company for 10 years. And I gave up my own business actually to come over to Autodesk because I thought and felt that they were uniquely positioned to be able to help me realize my passion and my dream of, you know, making sure that the industry is as productive as it could be. And it's really strange, like having come over in mid-February and then having COVID happen. It's like I went from sitting in meetings with C-suite executives talking about the fact that they really care about their clients, they really care about the industry, they care about their employees, and then watching this unbelievable event happen, and now being behind the scenes in lots of, you know, CEO COVID task force type activities. And it's really great. I mean, it's like validating everything they said when I was there thinking about coming over. They actually really do care about all of their customers and really do care about their employees. I don't know if you just saw, they just gave stock to actually all the employees that didn't have stock in their packages, and everyone is an owner now. And they're really, honestly, the C-suite executives and Andrew, as our CEO, has really just come out and said, go out and help people during this. And that's actually been quite just refreshing to hope, like, look, sometimes you make choices, and it just, for me, it got validated right away that I made the right move. So that was good for me.
You've never been to the office. Have you been to the Autodesk office in this, probably just at the very beginning, but you spent the
Yes, I was lucky enough.
Digital.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to go to San Francisco, to San Rafael actually. And then also over to Boston to our build space there, Boston, right before. And then I happened to be in Las Vegas, the place you want to be before there's a pandemic, for a couple weeks. And then I came home. So yeah, but I was lucky enough. We had an all company meeting prior to, so that was, for me, it's giving me a little bit of a head start and getting to do a lot of planning and meetings that probably I would have been on the road for. So it's a little bit, obviously I would never wish this on anyone, but people work, you know, obviously because we're into collaboration software and online collaboration cloud software, like we are able to like seamlessly work instantaneously, as well as our clients, from day one. And in some ways I feel like I'm actually busier. They're more worried about my health, my emotional health at the company, because we're so many hours in front of the computer, so much work that we're getting done. You know, they're constantly making sure that we have all the right tools and resources, that we take some downtime. And, you know, I'm a big fan of Peloton now. It's like, it's a big trend at the company. Everyone gets on their Peloton, and they're very supportive.
Company. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
you have a Peloton company account.
We have, well, we don't have an account. We actually have like a communication channel internally of those who are interested in Peloton, as well as lots of other topics. But so it's like they're keeping me honest about my workout schedule. And it's good because you have to, I could literally sit here in front of this computer now for 12 hours a day and not move. So I honestly think it's great that they're so caring about making sure that, you know, mentally I'm healthy and physically I'm staying healthy. But we have a lot of employees that have onboarded where they've never actually been to the office. And that's, I'm sure, just different. So I think the big messaging from all of that has been like, I don't think anyone really wants to go back to normal. We'd like to go back to better than normal. So that has been a question we've been asking ourselves. What do we want to keep doing after this is over? That has been really productive.
Yeah,
So
that's definitely one of the topics that I want to address maybe in the second part of our chat. I mean, your role is actually, you have a very long role. That is, let me read it. You're head of industrialized construction strategy and evangelism. What the heck
yes,
does
it
that
is.
mean?
It's a big title, actually, for a little girl. It's a big title. But yeah, so I think, look, the evangelism part is pretty self-explanatory. I
Yeah.
travel the world and go and talk about what's going on in industrialized construction. The words industrialized construction were on purpose, actually, that, I look at industrialized construction as well as Autodesk does, that it's really an umbrella term for things like design for manufacturing and assembly, which we'll get into, and prefabrication and, AR, automation and robotics and things like that, IoT, but and really in totality, things like lean manufacturing and digitization. So they kind of all live under that IC umbrella. And the strategy part of my role is to not just inform the current strategy at Autodesk, as well as, not just the product strategy, but the company-wide strategy, but also to work with strategy and get our clients and other people on the journey for IC so that they can really get more productive, right? So we're looking at enabling and empowering the AEC industry to get more
AC,
productive.
architecture, engineering, construction. Try to
Yes,
explain to the less
yes,
technical IC, industrialized construction.
right. So I think my whole passion is to really enable and empower the current industry and getting further along on their journey right now.
So let's talk about the big picture. I mean, we're in the business of supporting different industries in their approach to better efficiency and digitization and innovation as a whole. I mean, I've got in front of me a chart from McKinsey showing how the construction business, AEC, but in particular the construction business, is being not just flat in their efficiency, but if you read it in through different metrics, even less efficient than it was in the 60s. It's just as funny because the McKinsey is putting together construction and hunting as the two only, industries where, the efficiency has been flat, if not going down, going south. Can you explain us why that is?
Well, I think at the end of the day, McKinsey put out a report and it basically said we're second to dead last in spend on digitization, right? So, and agriculture and hunting, I think, was, almost equal with us on last. And I really, instead of like talking about the fact that we don't spend money on that, I think we have to ask ourselves, why don't we spend money on that? I like to think of every situation as maybe no harm was intended. Like, I don't think we go out as an industry and say, let's just not spend money on digitization. Let's make sure that we stick on paper forever and that we, don't change with the times. I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think that people oftentimes don't know where to spend their money and don't really know how to get on the journey, or the result of, the fact that we're so project centric and that we don't focus on R&D as even a category, that, because there are lots of companies that don't even have an R&D head or don't even think about R&D as, a role in construction, that's why we don't spend money in that. The fact is that oftentimes I like to say our R&D money in construction is really spent in the contingency line item. Like, we're spending it at the end when we have issues and problems, but we're not necessarily applying it to many different jobs because it's at the tail end of the cycle, and our cycles are so long. And then what happens with project teams is they just disperse and they go to different projects. So a lot of times, a lot of the learning is lost. That, I've been encouraging the industry to take a different viewpoint and take some of that money purposefully out of their contingency budgets, what they would normally put in contingency, move that up front in the process. And the first thing first is just get off of paper, right? So anything you need to do on your maturity cycle is, the first thing is you got to get off things that are on paper and get them onto digital platforms so that you can start looking at things and measuring things. Without that, these are just like, papers in the wind, if you will. And it's very hard to understand where you're at in the journey and where you need to focus on improvements if you don't get digital. So that's actually McKinsey's comment, is that we are, at the end of the industry is getting digital, right? It's almost like I walk on a lot of job sites and I see lots of technology getting dusty in the corner. while we still snap chalk lines. You know what I mean? It's like, wait a minute, we bought some laser scanning equipment or some other piece of equipment or some, manufactured item that would help us like measure something, and instead we're hand measuring still. It's like, why is that happening? Even when we spend it, sometimes we're actually not integrating the learning and the technology, because it's just, again, we're very project centric.
Yeah, and so from the other side, there's a huge opportunity because the gap is so wide that any step forward in digitization can be significant. Before we go there, just as out of curiosity, how long have you been in the construction industry, and why? How did you end up in construction?
So I grew up in the business. Actually, my family business is a general contracting construction management firm in New York, and still exists there. My little brother runs the company now. So I was dragged around to lots of job sites my whole life and worked for the family business to understand how conventional construction works. And then I was lucky enough later in life to have the opportunity to buy a 76-year-old steel and concrete modular manufacturing company on my own with some other people. And because I really did know that there was a better way to do things and a more productive way to do things. I'm really focused on productivity and making things easier. For me, it's all about easier all the time. So I was lucky enough to do that. So I evolved from, owning a modular company that did sub-assemblies like bathroom pods, multi-trade sub-assemblies, and full volumetric modules, multi-story. And then 10 years ago, started my own consulting business to help people optimize prefabrication within their programs and all through the design, procurement, and construction phases. So I've been really lucky to see the industry from lots of different geographies and also from different viewpoints. Like I've worked for the government of Singapore on their initiatives, and I've worked for big giant general contractors and CMs, and I've also worked with subcontractors and architects and engineers. And I think it's given me a good perspective from the stakeholders' positions all the way around. And lots of different materials and lots of different things on the prefabrication continuum, from, components and sub-assemblies and modules and things like that. So it really, I'm pretty blessed that I've gotten such a view of the world that I feel like is very unique perspective.
And we're going to talk about prefabrication in a moment. But before, let's go through some kind of definition also to set the stage. Help us define what is IC, industrialized construction.
So I think industrialized construction, the way that I really view the world, is you're bringing things out of away from the job site into a factory, into some sort of controlled environment, and you're able to attach systems and technology easier to them when you put them in that industrialized format within that factory space. And again, we're using terminology that is somewhat overlapping, right? So I said factory. And I love IC because there's things like lean manufacturing in there and design for manufacturing assembly. And I can attach things like, virtual reality and AR within that factory. It's just a little bit easier. But also, production methodologies like line manufacturing or group technology work cells or batch manufacturing, but also things like small automation that can be put into the factory. So it's really a catch-all phrase, industrialized construction, when I've moved things into more of an industrial format, almost like, I hate to use the car example, but I think, like the industrialized revolution, we're moving things away from the job site into the factory space so that we can actually become more efficient. I think there's a lot of terminology that gets confused in our space. Yeah. So it's funny, it's my fault a little bit in some ways, to be honest. So I've heard the use of industrialized construction to be equal to things like modern methods of construction in Europe. I just don't choose to use that anymore, although that was one of my favorite phrases. I think it makes more sense to say industrialized construction now, because in some ways, anytime I say modern, it's already old. Like before it's out of my mouth, like before it comes out, it's even old already. But, and then I think I hear a lot of people talking about things like offsite, which for me used to mean the same as prefabrication. But now when I see things like, Mace's factory on top of on-site on top of the high-rise, in reality, that's prefabrication on-site as opposed to prefabrication that gets done off-site. So you really can't use off-site anymore unless it's location-specific off-site, right? So for me, everything that I think about now is, I call it prefabrication. So everything from like intelligent materials through single trade components, multi-trade subassemblies, and then even volumetric modules. For me, those are elements of prefabrication as the umbrella, statement.
Right. How about design for manufacturing? That is another buzzword.
I love that you say that. So I get a little perplexed when I hear the words design for manufacturing and assembly in lieu of the word prefab. It actually does not mean that. It's not the same word. DFM and DFA have been concatenated, but those concepts of design for ease of manufacturing and design for ease of assembly come from the manufacturing world. It doesn't mean prefab. It's literally design principles and design methodology, design guidelines, if you will, that we use when we're designing buildings to enable ease of manufacturing and to enable ease of assembly. So it doesn't mean prefab. These are literally a set of principles. And I like to explain it like this. There are generic principles like design it once, use it many times, or design in for safety, things like that. Design things for multi-use, elements for multi-use. But then there are very specific DFMA principles and guidelines for different elements. So like if you're thinking about a bathroom pod, there's a list of design for manufacturing and assembly principles, like one of which might be design a single point of connection for supply and waste for ease of connections on site and ease of inspection. Like that's a very specific one for a bathroom pod, but not necessarily for a precast panel. So I think the heavy lift is that we have some generic design for manufacturing and assembly principles, and then there's some very element specific DFMA principles for different elements. And then I do think, like, just to make it a little bit more interesting, that lately I've been talking a lot about design for manufacturing and assembly and disassembly and reuse. So things like, especially when you're talking about COVID, not only do I have to put things out there rapidly, but I have to know that I've designed them in order to take them apart and reuse them. And not necessarily just for temporary, but even when I'm scaling up at a regular hospital or technology site, I want to be able to make sure that I've got that circular economy in mind when I'm designing for the materials that are going in. So it definitely does not mean prefab. Like it's one of the things in Europe that makes me a little crazy. Like I hear them say, especially in the UK, they love to use the term or DFMA as if it's the word prefab. And I think that's why designers are so confused sometimes. It's like, okay, they want to do prefab, but they need a roadmap how. They need to understand these DFMA guidelines how.
And to me, back to what we were saying before, the fact that construction is being very inefficient, at least hasn't improved efficiency by any stretch of the imagination. Manufacturing has by far, right? So if you see statistics of how more efficient in gross outcome from manufacturing compared to any other industry or some other industry, definitely with construction. I mean, that's to me a directional effort of how can we imply and apply some of the learnings and processes that actually worked well and have developed much better in manufacturing also for construction. So let's go straight into also your world of reference. So you're also known as the queen of the prefab. At least that's what I saw on when in a blog post that you guys posted when you started at Autodesk. So that's definitely your world of reference also for the previous 10 years of your business. You mentioned a little bit of the context around it, but maybe we could give some real example of where are we today in the world of prefab, what can be done, and what some examples that you lived through your past experience, and what can we go from there?
It's a great question. I think one of the disservices we do to ourselves in the industry is we only really talk about the sexy stories. So as an example, I mean, I've been on some of those jobs, so I'm to blame in some ways, that people only want to talk about a high-rise volumetric modular. They only want to talk about the brands of the companies that are doing those, volumetric boxes, if you will, the volumetric modules. And we forget that there's a huge current industry on things like single trade components and multi-trade subassemblies that really tremendous amounts of the subcontractor base are doing. And general contractors are figuring out how to integrate into big jobs. So lots of pieces and parts, if you will, aside from volumetric modules. And I would say, like, from a complexity perspective and just a vast quantity perspective, there's so much more being done on the multi-trade subassembly and single trade component path, far greater, like, I mean, exponentially greater than what's happening in the modular, volumetric modular business, because it's only really a very small amount of companies that are doing volumetric modules. And I want to dispel the notion that, like, we're all trying to get to volumetric modules as if it's a hierarchy. You know, it's not a hierarchy, and it's not the right tool for lots of different jobs. And I think we have to recognize that, that if we want to really promote the journey, we have to understand the journey and the workflows, how to do more single trade elements, how to do more multi-trade elements, also how to improve utilizing more and more intelligent materials. So things that are we can buy from factories that reduce drying time, curing time, welding time, hot work. You know, there's lots of, I mean, that's almost table stakes, you know, the intelligent materials business. And you're seeing a lot more of the manufacturers that supply the construction industry thinking about, how does my manufactured product fit into one of these categories? How do I do, how do I make my product more visible as an intelligent material? How do I, implement my material into something like a single trade component? Where does it fit in with a multi-trade component? But I think it's almost like the rise of the subcontractor as the manufacturing base that we are a little bit blind to. And we need to give a little bit more kudos to those guys that have started fab shops and have been recognizing the productivity gains that they've done, as well as, like, there are definitely some specialty manufacturers that have taken on multi-trade sub-assemblies and also volumetric mods in the space. So, but I definitely think the vast majority of prefab that's getting done is sort of unsung, and we need to really identify that as what's actually happening today, right? It's not that they just don't get enough attention. Maybe it's not as sexy, I get it, as the high-rise volumetric module, but they're doing so much of it, and they're on such a journey, and they've learned so much from it, that we really need to embrace the current AEC industry and what they have done and what we have learned, instead of talking as if it's like we should all want to be this thing up in the sky that isn't really what we're trying to accomplish.
Before we talked about the assembly, but also easiness of disassembly, you were mentioning. Let's talk about some, this is part of the macro trends of circular economy, the ability also to reuse components and material. Let's talk about material first. You mentioned intelligent materials. What's out there that draw your attention?
Oh my gosh, so many things. I mean, literally any type of piping system that I don't have to weld, any kind of framing system that's pre-cut and pre-drilled that, like, comes panel. I mean, like, literally anything that I can do that, has some sort of, like, an example would be, like, there's a product out there called Blaze Frame, and it's intumescent tape on track, and I don't need messy fire caulking. I always use that as one example. But Victaulic is an amazing, another example of intelligent materials where I don't have hot work. And, you're talking about things like the Hilti strut system where I can utilize racking, where I don't have to weld it, and it's easy to put together, and it's pre-kitted and pre-assembled. There's lots of things like that out there all the time that, really increase the flow of our job sites and are just easier to deal with. The unfortunate part is we don't measure them correctly. We ask the question to our estimating team, like, is that more expensive than just regular old fire caulk and track? And the answer is yes, like, of course it is, because I don't have wasted fire caulk. I don't have to throw it away. I don't have people there that are doing it. It's messy, and it's like, of course it's a little bit more expensive, but you have to look at the entirety of why we're using that intelligent material. It's going to increase flow on the job site. It's going to remove people from the job site that we don't have anymore in this industry in a skilled labor pool. And it's going to reduce trash and waste. And I think the circular economy question is such a good one, because in reality, like, we have the ability for sustainability in our industry in such a greater way if we do things within factories, to be honest. I remember years ago, we were doing a job, and actually we wanted points from the particular authority having jurisdiction, because we didn't actually have any waste, because we were pre-cutting all the material and pre-kitting it, and it was coming right to the factory, like pre-drilled and pre-cut. And I remember being frustrated. I actually couldn't get points in the point system, because the point system was based on me sorting my waste as opposed to, like, not having waste. And so we went back and forth with them about, isn't it shouldn't I get like double points because I actually don't have any, like I have nothing to sort. There's no, my dumpsters are pretty much empty. My bins are empty here. So I feel like, it's not only just about the fact that we're trying to be more efficient with our materials in the factory, but we're able to have relationships that are less based on bids, but more on, relationships that can keep feeding our factories, that are more like partnerships than they are like bidding out the lowest bidder. So we're able to then track where that material goes, where it is put in the job. And there's lots of technology out there right now where we can do a lot, especially asset management tracking within software that we have and that other people have, to be able to see where this is going and when it will actually hit its life cycle and when we can take it apart and reuse it. And I think, from a sustainability perspective, there's things like materials I'm very interested in, but then there's industry sustainability, the fact that like we're having a hard time attracting people to the space. And if I can create factories where there's a lot of technology integrated and we're digitizing things and there's lots of cool jobs for young people, but also, where I can make a better living for somebody where they can work indoors and co-locate their daycare near the factory. It's not just about material sustainability, it's about industry sustainability and also a more socially acceptable way to build, that we're providing a lifestyle and for a better place for all at the end. For us at Autodesk, that's one of the really important things and one of the great things about having some really wonderful people that care about that. Like for me, it's like I joined all of a sudden I came into a room where there's a lot of people that think like me instead of just me talking about it on my own. So I think that's a really nice thing, that people at Autodesk really want to make sure that this is for the good of everyone. And I think if we could impact some of especially what's going on right now with the stimulus packages that are out there, it's like, I don't want to see us do the same thing over and over again. I'd like to see us, like, if this case gets some money's come into play, that we require people to be more digital, and we require people to get some tools that we can measure some things, and we require people to do things like prefabrication and innovation. So we're setting ourselves up for a more sustainable industry, right? That's important for me.
Yeah, I want to talk about that right now. But before we go in there, you just mentioned one topic that I thought was maybe of interest for also the listeners. How do you track? You said there are ways to track the material and really where the material has been, and how circular that can be. How do you technologically do that?
I mean, there's lots of technology out there right now with RFID tags, and we've got some stuff that you can track through the design in the factory as well, that we've made some investment in at Autodesk. So you can track these materials as they're coming through, being procured and then being put into those sub-assemblies and then being put out on the job site. So as an example, like Manufacton is one of the companies that we work with that has software like that with great RFID tracking so that we can understand that. And then we're always looking, within the Autodesk Construction Cloud at things like understanding our asset management. We just actually partnered with Origo, which is an owner software as well. And, as owners are very interested in understanding where their assets are and where their assets lie. I mean, again, to be honest, as I always say, I'm not the software expert knowing every single module of each of our software, but I definitely get to hear some amazing case studies and stories of what we're focusing on in some of those areas. So I think it's important for us to recognize that that's important to our customers, that's important to them. And we do have tools that I hear about every day. Like I feel like at Autodesk, there's just so many amazing opportunities and tools that I get to hear about with case studies of clients using them to their benefit, that it's I don't want to say overwhelming, but it's certainly exciting. Like I feel like right before this call, I was like on a different call and we were talking all of a sudden about AR, and I was like, oh, I was just about to do this interview. I'd love to hear what you're doing. It's like they sort of come out of the woodwork every day. It's almost like if it was my birthday, I get a birthday cake delivered about 7 times a day at my house.
So let's talk about incentives and the greater good. And you were mentioning before, can we take this as an opportunity to be not back to before, but better than before? And it's actually
Right.
It is a potential reset. I think also the policymakers clearly matter in the prioritizations of what should be done first. I think Europe, and I want to hear from your perspective. You mentioned also Singapore initially as one of geographies that you work with significantly. I'm just saying, putting out there Europe, because we've been working with the European Commission quite some time, and even before COVID-19 happened, one of the biggest news they really put their self into and for was the Green Deal. So really try to look at support of the economy where sustainability as a core, as well as climate change and the greater good. So
Yeah.
what is your take on that? What do you think? What are also the geographies today where that is seen as a major priority to start, post crisis?
I wish I could say that that every government is looking at that as a priority. It's actually untrue, unfortunately. I think a lot of the government initiatives tend to be somewhat reactive, like they don't have time to like fix the system. They have to and I'm not discounting that we need to go and get hospitals up and do things quickly to save lives. And obviously that's true. I just feel like if we spent a little bit more time after this setting up some better processes, not just incentivizing people with like they do in Singapore. I mean, you can't get a building permit unless you're going to be utilizing things like BIM and, prefabrication of certain sorts to get a particular type of building permit. They're also doing monetary incentives, actually, when there's state-owned land or government-owned land and funded. And they're giving, I think at last look, they were doing on some jobs up to 10 million Sing for developers that were using volumetric modules and things like that. But we have to, again, I don't think it's any harm intended from the governments. I actually think they just don't know. They're unaware that the maturity cycle has to start with digitization, right? As we just said, and that you've got to get everybody on digital. And then you've got to get people off the job sites. We don't have the people, first of all. And I think some of the countries with the most constraints are the ones that have moved fastest because they have those constraints, right? It's like, what is it they say? Like, necessity is the mother of invention. So if you don't have people, you're going to figure out how to do more with, in factories because you don't have people. So there again, depending on the country, the more constraints they actually have sometimes, the faster they are to innovate. And I think that's important. So Singapore is a little tiny country, but they have really smart people that recognize that they have a limited amount of resources where they are. They don't necessarily want to bring in resources from outside all the time, and they want to figure out how to get smarter with what they have. So anytime that happens, and I think it's happening now in some ways, we've got to recognize that it's not enough just to say you want it. Like in the US, I always use this as an example. There are governments out there that don't want to give monies for initiatives unless their local residents are hired for jobs within that space. And I'm like, well, great, let's make them work. Let's figure out how to get them into factories that are socially more acceptable places to build and easier to get non-traditional employment for women and young people and, ex-cons you want to, put back into the system and veterans. Let's figure out a place that they're not all just on a giant dirty job site, in the middle, trying to figure out what to do. Let's put them in a place where there can be learning, where there's technology integration. It's a little easier. I'm not saying that doesn't happen on a job site, but when you build in a factory, the learning cycle is a little bit faster. It's a little bit more dispersed. So I don't have to be a master builder to work at one station to learn one thing. I could put one really experienced guy with 3 junior people, at a station. They can work ergonomically. They have a lunchroom. They're indoors. It's safer. We all know that from manufacturing and construction. It's I don't think they don't do that on purpose. I just think they don't know. So they're just doing the same stuff they've done over and over again. And it's they're moving so quickly that they forget that we have the ability to actually impact change when things happen like this. And so I'm just trying to remind them, this is your opportunity to put some caveats to that stimulus money that will make us a more sustainable industry next time this happens so that we can pivot, right? I'm constantly amazed that the manufacturing space is able to pivot. You have people that were brewing beer that now can make hand sanitizer. And you've got Louis Vuitton, who is making purses, can now make masks, or make ventilators. We in construction are so project centric and we don't have any baseline in anything that we're normally doing. But I've seen a little bit of a change. I've seen during this COVID, I've seen a lot of the subcontractors who have fab shops able to step up and start doing some of the rapidly deployable things. They were able to pivot. There's guys like Faith Technologies and guys like Poole and Kent and guys, general contractors like Bolt and other people that, at least in the US, and there's more over in Europe, that are doing great things because they were able to pivot a little based on, they can stand on the shoulders of some of the work they've done, or even things like, we work with Factory OS in some ways. They can pivot to different kinds of housing that are needed right now because they have this baseline of this production line, that they're doing, and they have partners they're considered essential workforce still, so they're still getting things into the factory, and we can pivot them to make other things. When you're all in on a job site and everybody just comes for the project, it's very hard to pivot, right? It's very hard to respond.
And it feels that to some extent also the private market is ready. I don't know if that's a good example, but here we have Katerra that is, by visibility, by the amount of money they've raised, just as a reminder, I think over $4 billion is actually from SoftBank, and Vision Fund is one of the investors. Actually, the founder is called Michael Marks. I assume there is no family there, but it's
not related,
not related, but very visible. Was the former CEO of Electronics and Tesla. So that's definitely, if there is something, I think there's a sign that also when put in with the right perspective, also there is also a lot of private capital being ready to be deployed. Back on COVID.
Let me comment on that, actually.
Yes.
I think in the last 5 years, I've seen more and more money invested in the space from lots of groups, right? And I think, some of the big content providers have really put a lot of money into the space. Some of the big funds have put a lot of money into, more than I've ever seen before, not just by volume. Like you're talking about one particular example with Katerra, but I've seen it across the industry in lots of different investments and lots of different companies, more than I've ever seen before. So I'm always like, follow the money. There's something there. It's almost like if you are in the investment space and you're putting money, look, we just said we're second to dead last in digitization. If we can just get digitized and move things into a more productive environment, the upside is huge, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're going from, it's almost like putting your money on the dead last horse in a horse race, right? Like in some ways, like you have no choice but to make money if you do anything right. So the good news is I've seen more and more attention to the space and more investment. The bad news is sometimes when we pull out one example, which again it's a good example, but I think we can't allow ourselves to let the industry hang on the success or failure of any one company, right? Because at the end of the day, it's just one company and their strategy and what they've decided to do, when there are lots of other companies out there that I see every day doing really amazing things, including Katerra. Like there are amazing companies out there that are doing things I could have never imagined, when I joined in the space almost 20 years ago. So, and also the investments coming from lots of places that I think if we don't recognize the fact that, people are really trying to integrate technology into the largest chassis possible, right? And that's not a car anymore. That's not my laptop anymore. That's not my phone anymore. That's not even my house anymore. And I dare say that's not even a building anymore. It's really a city, right? So like at the end of the day, I hear a lot about smart cities and technology integration. And I always think like, why would I build that smart city in the old fashioned way? Like we should really be thinking about technology embedded within the platform, the chassis that are the biggest possible chassis, because it's really all about that. It's more about, the technology we can actually integrate and get people on certain platforms than it is about the small amount of money we make in the construction industry compared to the guys that are putting money into the space, right? Like that's really important to recognize. If you don't recognize that and think about yourself as what part of this ecosystem are you an integrator in? Like what part of this ecosystem are you supporting in this new world? Then I dare say if you're not, or you can't answer that question, you may cease to exist very shortly.
Very true. And back to the idea of chassis and the necessity, I think was 10 days ago, probably a couple of weeks ago now, with this crisis time kind of as a different flow. It's hard to remember how long ago it could be, months or could be literally a few days ago. But there's a project that caught a lot of attention, also in Italian press. I'm Italian, also because one of the designer there is an Italian researcher that works at MIT, and kind of I think empowered also the world of open source, where they were shipping containers being built as emergency rooms, and then they can be clearly moved easily, and then collected and shipped in a way that could be much more efficient than building either a military camp for for people that need attention, or something that has to be re-engineered. That was a clear sample, from a very short period, very clear necessity how the community of innovators can get together and then eventually, create things that are modular and much more efficient. And it's probably sometimes it's just easier to build something from scratch and try to reassess things that are already out there. Were you following that project by any means?
I was. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think we have to be very careful of looking at the right solutions for the right timing for prefabrication, for the right application, and the right expectations, right? So there are things like containers that are quickly, utilized. There are certain pros and cons about containers. Look, once-use containers oftentimes have to be certified. They're not really looked at in the building code as assemblies. They don't really know how to treat them a lot of times. So I think they're great for rapid deployable. The same thing as, sprung structures, but the same thing as modular fleet, where we're actually building things for, schools or hospitals right now that are sitting in storage that people rent for hire in lots of places around the world that easily can be retrofitted or already purpose built for those types of applications. I don't know why we have this fascination with containers. Like, I think it's like, and by the way, I know a couple of Italians in the New York area that love containers as well. I think it's like
Legos, right? Because you have this block, this Lego block. Is people
I guess. I think it's very Brooklynish. If the people know, it's like very funky to say. But I will say this: what I caution against is to look at the right solution for that application and try to apply it everywhere. Like, I personally saw a comment about that job, and somebody was like, we should build every hospital like this, all high rise. And I'm like, wait a minute. Okay, hold on a second. The containerized situation is good for what we're using it for in this case. I don't think everyone who's doing 20-story patient towers would think to use containers as the patient room. That doesn't make sense. So in my opinion, maybe somebody's doing a containerized 20-story building at this point, but I have yet to see that come to fruition. And I don't think there are other options that are probably a better choice of a choice in the toolkit to do that. So I think as long as you recognize what that application is good for and what the barriers are going to be with something like that. Look, containers are great, but the second you cut into the structure, you've pretty much, the structural integrity of that has been, you've kind of ruined it, right? So if you're looking for any kind of clear span between spaces, you might as well just build a module from scratch. And it's kind of easy to do that as well. It's not so hard. So I think, again, it's just, you have to look at the right solution for the right application. I personally think they're great for what we're doing now, or for emergency housing when that stuff happens, or for things when we need something very quickly and they're there, just like sprung structures and modular fleet is. They're sort of, to me, equal in that grouping, right? And then sub-assemblies we can use in big open spaces like the Javits Center in New York, or, some big, or Queens. At the tennis center, there are lots of sub-assemblies there that we can rapidly deploy where we don't even need the container because we're in some open space. So I just caution people to make sure that they don't make the judgment that when they see a very specific application of one tool, that it's great for all the other applications we need prefabrication for. And that's the part that, I always say, listen, all prefabrication is not created equal, and it's just not the right solution for everything. And I would say that about the hardened volumetric module that has completely fully finished integrated MEP and finishes. It's not the right solution actually sometimes for something else. So I say it at the, sort of one part of the spectrum all the way up to the top. So you just have to really understand the parameters in which you're looking at, what the drivers are, what some of the political and social and economical impacts are, and the technology to pick the right combination of solutions. Because that's really where the smarts are, right? It's not just in picking one that looks cool, but I think we're very media focused, right? We love the sexy. We're like, wow, I don't know. I feel like we're all about the shiny object instead of, look, I played competitive rugby for 15 years. And I was, for those of you who know rugby, you're Italian, so you know rugby. I was in the front row. I was a blue collar worker. I just worked hard and kept moving and kept moving. The guys that were in the backs and fixed their hair and scored every once in a while that got all the attention. I'm a fan of the blue collar worker, just getting us there and making sure that it's all correct. So I think that's where this comes from for me.
Yeah. So let me get you on the last point more on the shiny object again. Just look at
Sure.
the future, just to finish this conversation, I can go forever. We look at a lot of technologies for some of our clients when it comes to digitization of the construction business in general, or parts of it. And so I mentioned just the three examples as 3D printing construction has been talked about for a long time. I remember actually when I was at Google 10 years ago, the large scale 3D printing was one of the projects potentially as a moonshot, and still I haven't seen it at scale. We can talk about AR and VR, the use of more tools really to be more efficient, and remote assistance, or maybe all the automation and robotics that can actually help digitize this, the process that we just mentioned. Is there any area that gets you particularly excited that you think, that's definitely something that I haven't looked at yet so closely, but it gets me excited because it's addressing an issue that I've lived in the my last 20 years in construction?
It's so funny. I think every one of those things you just mentioned, from like additive manufacturing, I mean, I watch them 3D printing bathroom pods now in Singapore, and I watch, the largest, I think there was the largest office building recently that was printed in Europe. And I think that's great. And I think that's an aspirational place for us to get to. And there's lots of cool things happening in additive manufacturing right now. I think AR, VR, for me, is really exciting, along with automation and robotics. I think we have barely, forget about robotics in construction, I feel like we've barely scratched small automation, which will get us transformational change. I think lots of these fab shops, we tell them to be manufacturers, and they're like, yep, we need to be more like manufacturers. And they kind of walk out of the door and they're like, what's a manufacturer? It's like a big secret all of a sudden. And like, I feel like, when I talk to guys like Brent McPhail, and we talk about, from Brave Engineering, we talk about automation that's been in the other industries for years and years and years, that easily we could adapt to construction, because it's exactly the same processes we do in construction. And they've been around for like 10 and 20 years, some of these machines. It's not new automation. I think robotics gets a little bit more exciting, and like, obviously there's big transformational change. But for us in our fab shops, automation would be amazing. I mean, and then I love, honestly, some of the AR, VR that's going on. I mean, you talk about COVID. The first COVID patient, I think, was taken to Nebraska Medical Center. And we have a client, MCL Construction, and they literally did AR with the group to talk about how they were going to be, fitting out some of the first COVID patient rooms and some of the medical spaces that are there. They do it all the time on things, even like dentistry buildings and stuff. So I think each one of those things for me is very exciting, and I think is going to move the needle forward. I think, honestly, the part, it's going to sound a little bit cheesy, that I think that word in English means like a little bit sappy, a little bit soft. But the part that's most exciting to me is that I see some of the big players in the space, all the way down to the little players, embracing changes in behavior and their thought process. Like, I think that's the biggest change I've seen, monumental shift in the last 10 years. It's like, it's easy to put in automation into your fab shop, but to change behavior and thinking is like moving, an iceberg. And I feel like that's the part I'm most excited about. Like, I feel like I see people and talk to companies now that 10 years ago wouldn't give me the time of day. And now they're like, we have to be on this path, and here's what we're doing, and we know how important this is. So I would say, like, the part that excites me the most is, the change in thinking and behavior of those that have really embraced the journey. So I don't know if that's the right answer. It's not a technology.
No, but actually I think it's very thoughtful, because the technology is a tool if you have the right mindset to use it at best. And so first we need to work on the mindset of something that's not being digitized and innovative at the core. And so education, I think it becomes key. So
I always say it like this: it's not hard to prefabricate pipe. It's actually hard to enable a process, a culture, and leadership that allows you to prefabricate a pipe, right? It's like, that's not the hard, it's all the other things around that. And so for me, I've just seen such a big shift in the thinking, the culture, and the leadership around the topic, that the rest will be easy. If your organization, I call it prefab readiness. If you're like, or IC readiness, if you've got IC readiness within your culture and your strategy and your tools and your, the people the rest is easy. The rest is really easy, And I think that's the big secret. I always say, like, look, BIM was not the end. It was just the beginning. It was the highway that's going to allow all these cars to go really, really fast now. So, like, if you don't get digitized and get on and get on, 3D and get on Revit and things like that help you go really fast, it's going to be harder for us to help you get, to get on your journey. So that's the best advice I could give you, probably.
Amy, I think that's a perfect end. So thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. I cannot shake your hand, but I can just give you 5. And so
Ciao. Thank you.
Great talking to you. All the best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.